I'm Kyle Malnati, your host of the Calibrate Real Estate Podcast. At Calibrate, we exist to help people create generational wealth through real estate. My personal mission is to encourage, empower, and educate you by sharing best practices from business leaders that are proven winners. Coming at you from the Mile High City. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Calibrate. I'm your host, Kyle Malnati. Today's guest is actually a repeat. We had Scott Ratthbun on our last episode, but that was quarter one data from 2026. This is quarter two construction data, rental data, information about the apartment market, but also information about new homes, being a first-time home buyer. And the coolest part of it is it was a part of my mastermind group. I've been a part of Denver masterminds for a decade. It's an invite-only group. Typically, the people that are in that group are, 20 years in the business or longer. They typically operate a high-producing real estate team, or they're actually a brokerage owner. And I got the ability to join this group that Rick Miller had put together back in 2014. And it has been some of my best friends and colleagues in the community. Well, we rotate who hosts the lunch. There's about 24 of us. So once every 2 years, your job is to bring an expert speaker and to bring amazing lunch and conversation. And so it's kind of scary a little bit. It's kind of, you feel that risk of like, okay, I want to be as good as the last person. And there's definitely a one-up mentality in this group of Eagles. So listen in as Scott Ratthbun from Apartment Appraisers and Consultants and Apartment Insights speaks to this group. You hear a live Q&A. My podcast producer, Kayla, and I have edited it down to really a succinct amount of information. I will say, though, that the episode was almost 2 hours long when we started editing. And so if you have an interest in the full length thing, we may put that onto YouTube. But for now, we're trying to keep this to an hour, and I hope you enjoy it as always. My goal is to either educate or entertain. Those are the two E's that I was told by my career coach a long time ago when creating podcast content. So this is going to be a lot of education, and we're going to do the best we can to make sure that it's succinct. And you will want to check it out on YouTube because the slides are not something that we can put in the notes of the podcast, but you can see those on YouTube and you can see all the data. So without further ado, here's Scott Ratthbun from Apartment Insights talking to you about Denver multifamily market. We're going to cover rent. We're going to cover vacancy, concessions, construction, rent control, new home starts, all this great statistics. So join me in welcoming Scott Ratthbun.
Housing. Two main drivers of housing are population growth and employment growth, right? So we're going to talk about kind of what's driving housing demand right now. Again, I'm a multifamily guy, so you guys can tell me how this differs for single family for sale product. But at the end of the day, the reason that Denver has been a great place to build, whether it be single family or multifamily, is because we've had a very long history of very strong, very steady growth. And you will hear discussion of the fact that population growth is slowing, and that is true everywhere, including Colorado. The good news is that you can see that line, it's not like it's leveling off or falling off a cliff. We're still having population growth. It's just slower than it used to be. But that's an incremental thing. So keep in mind that there is still future growth, still future demand. And we've had a 1.5% annual kind of Hager type growth from 1980 all the way through current. This is where we've been. This is where we're headed. Natural changes in the blue, obviously, plus births minus deaths. Then the purple is our in-migration, and our in-migration has really been our major driver. You can see that natural growth really wasn't all that big over time, and it does shrink here. It's been shrinking, and then it kind of levels off right around here moving forward. In-migration is the big issue, and what you will see is that we have historically had a couple times of slight out-migration back during the dot-com bubble years, and then we had some out-migration during 2021. Post-COVID and during COVID. Interestingly, we'll talk about this later, but this is why I say that population and employment growth are not a perfect proxy for housing demand, because at this point where you see basically out-migration roughly matching natural change for almost a zero growth that year, we set historic absorption, apartment absorption numbers that same year. So the same year where we had no population growth and obviously anemic. I guess we had some employment growth, but it was really not natural. It was just turning the spigot back on after COVID. This was our historic absorption year. We're now catching up to that. We've actually set new historic records in 3 of our 4 metrics this quarter.
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
So, and just correct me, I'm sure I need it, but it seemed like, at least from our perspective, from the housing perspective, everyone was coming here during COVID. It was like, oh my God, everyone was coming from New York and California and Chicago. And that was the reason why we had so many buyers and the market was crazy. So it's so funny to see that, because that's not how it felt.
That's not how it felt in my industry either. And I pushed back on the demographer's office over and over and over again. And they do have an answer, and I halfway believe their answer. But I also believe a couple of things. One, I don't think these numbers are actually completely right. I think that the work from home movement, especially that started very strongly during COVID, is really hard to count.
Right.
And so these numbers don't do a good job of counting that. And I also think that, frankly, the 2020 census data is kind of crap because it happened during COVID.
Right.
And so we don't really have a good base to start from. And so you're starting with imperfect data, you're working with imperfect data, right? And so all the demographers' offices are using the federal census data, and they're using it and they're adjusting it as best they can, but they're starting with an imperfect data set because we didn't get a normal census in 2020 the way that we've gotten every other year, every 10 years in the past. So I think that there are some imperfections in this, but this is what the demographer's office is reporting. And what you will see is that we're supposed to have a couple of years of anemic in-migration, and then in-migration does come back a little bit, okay?
And guys, real quick, if you have a question and Scott calls and you say your name, just because he doesn't know who we are.
Okay.
True. Yes.
That's Kelly. Matthew.
So really what matters with absorption rate is new household formation. Are you gonna?
Yeah, we'll talk about household formation as well. So we're gonna move on from this slide, but the one thing I will say is that one of the things that's also impacting this that I don't think the demographer's office has had a chance to keep up with yet is the fact that we have differing immigration policy now than we had in the past.
Yeah.
And so I think that in-migration could be is likely to be negatively impacted. So population change, and these are admittedly a year old. The demographer has not updated these slides, even though I've asked them to. But what you will see here is this is total population change for the next basically 5 years. And by next, I mean the 2020 through 2024. So from the census to now, what you will see is these blue is out migration.
Oh, yeah.
So Denver, out migration, Boulder, out migration, all the rest of the county in migration. Right? So we did see people moving in just into the suburbs during this time period. We saw people leaving Boulder, we saw people leaving, Denver and Jeffco. Net migration. Okay, so that was population change. This is specifically migration. Again, what you will see is out migration, Denver, Boulder, Jeffco. But in migration in those other cities. Now that's historical. Let's look at what they're predicting. Projected population change. In our 7-county area, there is not a single blue section there. So they do expect that the population is going to go up in all 7 of our counties. They also expect that it's going to go up in Larimer and Weld and in El Paso and in Pueblo County. So basically the entire Front Range is still going to see population growth through 2034, according to the demographer. This is a year even older than this because they haven't updated this, but this is just a state-by-state migration from and to Colorado. So you get an idea of where people are going, where people are coming from, and where we top as far as our net is concerned. So as I said, I am a native and I grew up with my grandparents talking about the damn Californians and the damn Texans.
That's right.
And they are still our top 2 importers of people, followed by North Carolina, Virginia, and Arizona. But we do trade back and forth with both Texas and California quite a bit as well.
They
So-
come and they go back.
Exactly.
More people.
But more people are moving to Florida, more people are moving to Nevada.
Years ago.
So sadly, these are 6 months out of date, but the story is still the same. We're moving from population change to employment growth. What this is telling us is that, hey, COVID was unprecedented. We turned off the economy, then we turned the economy back on. So you can basically ignore this and ignore that because that is unnatural. But what has happened since we recovered from COVID is we've seen a steady decline in employment growth, right? To the point now where we basically have zero employment growth in the Denver metro area. That's not a surprise to any of you here. It's all over the news. Okay. What happened? Same thing. This is monthly totals and annual averages. You can see the fall, the recovery, and then basically the flattening out. That's comparing Denver to the nation. Same thing. Now we will see that post-recession, Great Recession, Denver recovered faster than the nation. But then we followed the same patterns, right? We're just above the nation until recently. But again, recovery flattening out for everybody. Now, when you compare us to the national averages, historically, we've had higher employment growth than the national average. Right now, we're basically at or below the national average. So Denver is not doing well. You know, back during this period of time, I like to say this is the time when Denver was open for business. Denver is no longer open for business, and we can feel the effects of that.
Do you know if statistics include gig jobs?
So again, this is where it gets really hard to count gig jobs. It gets really hard to count work from home jobs, you know, those types of things. And that's where you have to take all of this data with a grain of salt because the economists and the quants are trying to figure out how to count those. So yeah, again, all of this, and even when you hear the numbers come out from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, don't believe any of them until they're 6 months old because they're going to get restated, right?
Just politically. And
they're also politically influenced. Which is why they come out one way and then get restated quietly 3 months later. But this is an important graph. It's kind of complicated, but the point here is that annual employment change versus annual apartment absorption. There is not a one-to-one correlation. As employment growth goes up, absorption goes up. Yes, it does. You can see that as the blue lines are going up, you can see the absorption is going up. You can also see that absorption is kind of a leading indicator. We can see absorption fall off before we see negative job growth. Then we see the same thing here. Absorption falls off, then we see negative job growth. Here we see absorption falling off, and then we see COVID, right? But what this also shows you is that during these negative job growth periods, we have positive absorption in the apartment world. Why do you think that would be?
Rent when they can't afford to buy.
Because as the economy goes bad, renting becomes a more affordable option, right? And so the economy being bad is actually a benefit to the rental world if you're an apartment owner.
We know we have all the condos for sale.
Yes, fair enough. So just keep in mind, it's not a one-to-one, right? We see positive absorption all the time when we see negative population growth and when we see negative employment growth. So why have apartments done so well? And this is, I only update this in the first quarter and in the fourth quarter and the second quarter every year. I don't want to deal with updating it every quarter when the national numbers come out. But what you will see, not a surprise to any of us here, is that all of the major metro housing markets are in the top quartile of the most expensive housing markets in the country, including all the way down to Colorado Springs. Right? Colorado Springs is just above that quartile line. Boulder wasn't recently, it's so much more affordable. It's the 12th. It used to be the 8th. So it used to be top 10. Now you should all go buy houses in Boulder because it's affordable. That was a joke, guys. So obviously, what is this doing? Well, if our median home price in Denver is $650,000, we have good workers. We have highly paid workers here. We don't have an environment where we can afford a 20% down on a $650,000 home, median home, right? Not even not even above average,
And not a nice house.
not a nice house. So a 20% down on this, everybody can afford the mortgage on this. They make enough money to pay a really nice monthly mortgage. Instead, they pay a really nice monthly rent because they can't save for the down. They cannot afford the down. So this, for years, has been pushing people from the for sale product into the rental product. Same thing here. You will see that back in 2005, the median home price in Denver was 13% above the national average, and Colorado Springs was just below, but basically on par. We used to be as high as 60% above the national average. Again, everything has gotten so much more affordable over the last few years. We're only 56% above the national average now. And Colorado Springs has basically taken Denver's place from 20 years ago as now 12% above the national median home price. All right, so we're moving on. Now we're going to get into rents and vacancies for apartments, okay? So what has all of this done to our apartment world? Okay, so I wanted to push this slide back a few because I'm going to start showing you guys statistics by year of construction. And I realized that that would be a better place to put this, but I didn't get that change made before we started. So keep in mind that up until recently, the 1970s were the big behemoth year that we built apartments in Denver. We built basically 44,000 apartments. That used to be like 25%, 30% of the entire market. Less building in the 80s, even less building in the 90s. And then we started ramping things up in the 2000s, and we really killed it in the 2010s. We built 25% of our entire apartment stock in that 10-year period in the 2010s. Okay, and then we're on par to do something similar in the 2020s. We'll see what happens in the second half of the 2020s because we've had a couple of real rough years.
How many of these would have been condos in the early 2010s?
Right. So, and I have a slide and we can talk about, but the reason this happened, as we all know, is construction defect, right?
Yeah.
Construction defect litigation came in and basically stopped condo development. And as a result, took all a rising tide floats all boats, right? Well, if you stop building the entry level affordable product, then the median home price goes whoop, like that real fast because it's no longer, and I know we kept track of them differently, but from a buyer's perspective, if I'm a 27-year-old looking to buy my first home or 24-year-old looking to buy my first home, that condo is an easier entry point for me than a single family home. Especially today compared to, what it looked like in 2009. I bought my house in Platt Park in 2008. Could not afford my house today. I am very lucky to live where I live and do not envy anyone buying in today's environment, or the last 15 years of environment. So let's move on. What happened in Denver? Okay, so this is where we start using our crystal ball and we look at what's happening in the market and we start predicting what's going to happen with rents and vacancies. Historically, let's ignore everything before 2010. That's long, long ago. So let's talk about what happens from 2010 onward. What you'll see is that for years, we were completing, the orange bars are taller than the absorption. So you all understand absorption, right? Just units that are being sucked, being leased, right? That they're taken off the market because they're leased. We were completing more units than we were absorbing. If you complete more units than you absorb year after year after year, what happens to vacancy? You're leaving more and more units empty, vacancy goes up, right? So we saw vacancy go up consistently from 2010, basically all the way through 2019. And we were predicting that, or even through 2020, we were predicting that vacancy was going to get to a dangerous point. Well, then 2021 happened, and we actually absorbed a whole bunch more units than we completed that year. And we kind of ate into all of that historical vacancy that was building up. And so vacancy went whoop and fell back down right at this point in time. And then the next year we picked right back up with it. And if you ignore everything that happened before 2024, what you will see is a relatively balanced market. It was very good. We saw good, strong rent growth, but it wasn't outsized. It was 3 to 5% rent growth per year. Nothing crazy. Sometimes it was higher, sometimes it was lower, but pretty consistent. At this point, again, ignoring everything from here forward, I was told by the development community, we have a natural governor on our development. We do not have the labor to build more than about 13,500 units in the Denver metro area. We hit 10,000 units for 4 years in a row. We could not build more than that. No matter how big the pipeline got, we could not deliver more than 10,000 units. Then we broke through that and we built basically 13,000 units for a couple of years. Our previous high was 13,000 units delivered in 2018. And then it fell back down and then it came back up to 13,000. And then 2024 hit and we delivered 23,000 units.
And when were those all designed?
During
and
COVID.
Ideated and
So this
permitted?
part of this is the result of holding the horses back at the gate during COVID and then releasing them kind of all at once as the economy opened back up.
Scott, did you put the permit slide in here?
Yeah, there's later.
Permits will be in here, Amanda, that'll tell you when those started. And when permits are applied for, those projects are moving forward. And that takes about 30 months to complete
Right.
an apartment building.
I call it 3 years, but it's actually 2.5. It's actually 30 months. And so, yeah, and you don't pull a permit till you're ready to go, right? When you pull that permit, as Deion Sanders says, we come, right? Those units are gonna get delivered. It's very rare that you pull a permit in that unit because it's coming out of the ground at that point. And we do see, if you've driven, past 10th and Wadsworth, you do see every once in a while a deal that comes out of the ground and then stops. I'm sure we've all driven past that deal. Somebody has bought that deal and is now going to pick that back up. That was an absolute mess, but that does not happen in a normal situation. And so 3 years prior to this, what you will see is huge numbers of permits being. So we delivered 23,000 units. We absorbed 11,000 units. So we left 12,000 units empty in a single year.
Yes.
And vacancy spiked, right? Obviously, we delivered way more units than we absorbed. And then the next year we delivered 14, absorbed 14. But that meant we still had 12,000 units hanging vacant from the previous year. So vacancy remained elevated. In 2025, that was 2025. For many reasons that we'll discuss later, the construction pipeline of apartments is falling. And so in the future, we expect that we will get back to absorbing more units than we complete. Because the pipeline is falling and we've had historically high absorption. And I don't see that changing unless you guys get worse at your jobs and stop selling things for so damn much money. Right? And so we're going to start seeing that pipeline fall off and absorption continue to hold up. The only thing that would change this is absorption starts to go away if, for whatever reason, we don't have people who need homes. And right now, that's obviously not the case. So moving forward, we expect vacancy will come back down. So let's talk about vacancy. So again, you'll see here the squiggly lines here. First of all, let me take a step back. Stabilized vacancy versus all property vacancy. Stabilized vacancy is for properties that are stabilized. They've reached their basically 92 to 95% occupancy level. And we switch them from lease up to stabilized. And we monitor those differently because in a normal market, a stabilized property doesn't care what's happening in the lease up market. That's a whole different animal. Their operations don't impact my operations. I'm just trying to maintain occupancy. I have 200 units. We turn over half of them, so we have to turn 100 units every year. That's 8 units a month. That's very doable, right? So we don't worry about what's happening at lease up. And so we track this number. And when you do a correlation analysis for rent growth is more highly correlated to stabilized vacancy than it is to all property vacancy. That's why we present both. There are some people who accuse us of lying about vacancy because technically the real vacancy, when you include all the units in lease up, is actually 9.5%. We tell you it's 6.3%, and then they get all mad at me. And I say, no, I told you both. But for the people who own buildings and are operating them in a normal environment, they care about this number a lot more than they care about this number. That changed when this number got up here, right? So all property vacancy includes everything that's stabilized as well as everything that's in lease up. And what you can see is that we had a historical high of about 12.5% a couple of years ago. And so what that did was put huge downward pressure on rents, concessions spiked, we still have a big concessionary environment. And so rents, we had a top-down pressure pushing rents down, and that those concessions are working. I will show you here in a minute what has happened to vacancy, but you can see the stabilized vacancy in a equalized a market in equilibrium. People try and shoot for about 5 to 6%. If you're down at 2%, 3%, that's what I call frictional vacancy. You can't be below that because you have people moving out. You have physical vacancy just based on turn, right? Only really unhealthy markets have 100% occupancy, and that's what we have in the mountains a lot of times because no one moves, no one leaves their unit because there are no other units to have. And so that's an unhealthy environment. Healthy environment, 5 to 6% stabilized vacancy, hoping for 3 to 5% rent growth, 3 to 4% rent growth. And so people set their models to try and target that level. We had shot up above 7% for a while, up above 6% for sure. Well, we just had a huge reduction. We were at 7.27% a year ago or last quarter, and we're now at 6.332. So we're down 115 basis points quarter over quarter. Still only down 7 basis points year over year, though. All vacancy is down 147 basis points quarter over quarter and 142 basis points year over year. And that's because we had such high concessions in the new stuff that got delivered to try and fill those units. You will hear of a see-through office building, right? The office buildings sit empty for years. They're vacant, and you can literally look through one window straight through to the other side. There's no such thing as a see-through apartment community. They will lower their rents until we fill their units.
Fair.
So moving on, what has happened to our lease-up inventory? We got to a huge point of lease-up inventory. Now our lease-up inventory is 30,000 units, but only 11,000 units of those are still vacant. Now keep in mind, there were 12,000 units that were hanging over from 2024, but we still have natural vacancy in all the stabilized properties. So that means we've eaten into that 12,000 unit vacancy. You can see that vacancy just in lease-up units was as high as almost 20,000, was maybe 18,000 units a couple of quarters ago. So we've eaten down into that faster than I expected to. I predicted that vacancy would be at 6.9% by the end of this year, and in Q2 we're at 6.3%. I should also mention, by the way, these squiggly lines are because we have a seasonal market. So vacancies go up a little bit in the winter and vacancies go down a little bit in the summer. Dotted line is just a trailing 12 average to smooth that out. Same thing on rents. Rents go up a little bit in the warmer quarters and go down a little bit in the colder quarters. Moving on, lease-up vacancy rate. We were all the way up at 63%. We'd only seen at that level once before, way back post Great Recession. We're all the way down at less than 40% now. So these huge concessions that everybody started offering have done their job. We are absorbing units like crazy right now. We have a huge, and right now you can see that we're at a lease-up vacancy rate at the same level or lower than we were back here when we had rent growth. So you guys don't care about this. My clients are like, oh my God, finally good news. Because the last 2 years have been real rough. The last 3 years have been not so great. Vacancy by year construction. Again, go back to what I just talked about, what these all do. Obviously, nothing happens in a bubble. These are all averages that I'm talking about. So you can see that every different vintage has a different vacancy, and all the vintages had elevated vacancy, but 2010s, 2000s, and 1990s are now back into a place of normal stabilized vacancy. 4.2% of the 90s product is actually below. They're going to start seeing rent growth like that. Even 6% for 1980s, that's just at the top level of that stabilized level you want to be at. 2020s, which includes, and these are for only stabilized properties. This does not include lease-up properties. Stabilized properties for 2020s is at 70, or is at 7% vacancy, and then 1970s is at 9% vacancy. Why is this? High apartment vacancy indicates that our housing crisis relates to for sale, not to rental product. The average person can no longer buy the average house, but they can rent the average apartment. Okay, so why is this? This is why we have historically high concessions. Okay, so right now, we're at 9.7% on average for the whole market concessions, which represents just under 5 weeks free. More than 4 weeks free, under 5, just under 5 weeks free. I also present because I inherited these slides from my previous boss. The rent by dollar amount, but I hate that number. It looks really big, but if you think about rents go up over time, so concessions go up over time. So that dollar amount really doesn't mean anything because it's a bigger dollar amount on a bigger rent. So the percentage vacant, the percentage concession is really the one you want to pay attention to. And what you will see is back here, we were under 2% for a long time. We did do some concessions during COVID to keep heads on beds because nobody knew what was happening, and it was this reactionary thing of we're not going to raise anybody's rents, we're going to even offer concessions, we want to make sure we keep our buildings full because we don't know what the future holds. And then as soon as COVID was over, concessions basically fell down to nothing, and then all of a sudden concessions are up here. This is the highest concession we've had in like almost 20 years.
Feels it.
Yeah, but 5 weeks is not, it's not 6 months.
Free rent.
So it's.
But on brand new properties, it's 10 to 12 weeks free.
Right.
We signed our daughters up.
Average, right?
Just right over here by Industry, and it was like, they're like, here's 5 months free.
Right, like that's what
Wow.
on the new stuff that's in lease up right now. That's why normally this is 2% for the whole market. That's less than a week free for the
How
whole
long do they have to
market.
sign a lease for?
So we're like at a 5 times right now. What would be normal? What a normal operator would want to see.
So here's where this does matter. When that stops happening to Justin's daughters, they then say, now it's time to buy a house. So
Right.
you want concession to come down because once it becomes a more regular market, people say, well, there's not an incentive for me to live in a brand new apartment community with a pool in my early 20s. Now it's time for me to couple up or buy a house or buy a condo, whatever.
We pretty much forced them to hold that as down payment for something. Like, it's not free money, y'all.
Yeah.
We're still gonna take that.
And to that point, right? Look at this. This is concessions by year of construction. What you will see is that all the years of construction had concessions go down, except for 70s, which flattened out. And 2020 is technically still ticked up a little bit. It went from 14.2 to 14.4. 14% is approximately 7 weeks free on average for every single property that's stabilized, that's not in lease up. And that's because the ones in lease up are offering 10, 12 weeks free. All right, so this isn't updated yet because I haven't done the apartment. I also do the Apartment Association of Metro Denver survey. And I haven't gotten to that because I just got my own numbers done. So this doesn't have the second quarter numbers yet, but what this is just a reminder of is that these are all averages. Obviously, everything's different locationally. Real estate is location, location, location. So you're going to see that we have higher vacancy rates in certain counties and lower vacancy rates in other counties. We have higher vacancy in Denver because we have downtown where we built a whole bunch of high rises that have 300 units in them that are all in lease up that are trying to lease up. And then we
also have a legislative policy there that's hurting Denver County property.
right and that's headed for the whole state. Yeah.
Look at me like that. In my neighborhood.
It's coming for everybody. Yeah, I fear we're staring rent control in the face.
Oh, that's coming back to the state legislature this year.
And we don't have a governor who's gonna
Yeah.
veto it this
Yeah,
time.
exactly.
So moving on. Again, gross rents,
Wait,
effective rents.
What's rent control? Could you just dumb that down for me, please?
Well, there's a million ways to do rent control. Right now, the city and county of Denver has basically rent control light, which is their inclusionary housing ordinance, expanding housing affordability, which requires you to build 8 to 15% of your units in a market rate deal as subsidized as affordable at 60 to 80% of AMI.
Okay.
What that is doing is basically saying, hey, and it's all locational. If you're in this part of Denver, then it's lower percentages. If you're in this part of Denver, if you're downtown, it's the higher percentages. And so let's just say that you have to build 15% of your units, and 15% of your units have to be at an average of 70% of the area median income. Then that means that the other 85% of the units in the building have to make the math work. which means that their rents have to be above market in order to subsidize the rents at the subsidized units. And guess who pays above market rents? Nobody. So that makes those deals economically infeasible, and they don't build anything new, which is why we have a huge fall off in the pipeline. And in the city and county of Denver, 50% of all apartments have historically been built within the boundaries of the city and county of Denver. That's the 800-pound gorilla of where we build the densest, largest properties with the most number of units. And we're basically effectively, we've turned off the spigot, and we're not going to be delivering units in the city and county of Denver soon. They're trying to work on that. We'll talk about that in a bit. They're trying to fix that, but from the time the inclusionary housing ordinance came out, I went to city council screaming, and I was like, this is a terrible idea if you don't do something to make the math work. And they're like, well, it worked in Atlanta, and it worked here, and it worked here. And I was like, yes, and those have tax abatement for the units that you're asking people to subsidize. Your program does not have tax abatement. Here are the programs that didn't have tax abatement, and not a damn one of them worked.
I see. You found other markets that did have tax.
Right, and so if you put the tax abatement in, it makes the math work. Again, equity seeks a return, and if the math that says, I'm not going to get the return, then I as a developer can't get an equity investor to pay me to build something. So we don't build it. Right?
And they're not talking about a tax abatement in Denver?
They're now talking about tax abatement in Denver 4 years later, because what I predicted is exactly what's happening, and now they're freaking out about it. I'm trying very hard to get an audience with Mayor Johnston, and I'm trying very hard now to get an audience with Phil Weiser, because I want to talk to him about what's happened in the market.
And just remember, it takes 30 months to build new product.
Right.
So any delay in that, it just continues to push it down another 2.5 years.
So, but what you will see here is historically, gross rents and effective rents there was a difference between them. That means that we offered concessions historically. Then right around 2012, 2013, those two numbers snapped together, and they stayed together until COVID. Why is that? What happened in the market that caused us to stop offering concessions? The advent of algorithmic rent program setting, right? Algorithmic rent programs, Yardi, YieldStar. You put all the data into the black box. The algorithm tells you what your rent should be, and you don't offer concessions. You literally change your base rent weekly, daily.
Yeah.
If you go and look at apartment rents online, you can literally see different rents from day to day. You will go back to the same apartment the next day, and the rent you see on that unit is now changed. It is different because their algorithmic rent program setting told them that they needed to increase the rent or they needed to decrease the rent based on their target vacancy and everything else that they put in as their targets.
Didn't the state legislature pass a bill though that said they cannot use that this last session, that they cannot use the
Yes.
algorithmic?
Yes. Yes, they
Yeah,
did.
so I know we fought it very hard, but.
They did pass
but
it.
got passed.
It did get passed. And I don't think that, so here's what I actually think happened. I think that we took the human element out of rent setting, and that it's very easy to have a computer tell you, this is the number you can get, and for you to say, okay. And they were getting those numbers. I don't think it was collusion. I don't think people got into a room and were all like, hey, if you promise not to lower rents, I promise not to lower rents. Even though vacancy's going up, we're all just going to hold strong. That's not what happened. But before this, it was a human person calling their comps and saying, what are your rents? And even when the rents were going up, someone engaged their brain and went, I cannot raise these people's rents 15%. I just can't do it as a human to another human. And so we kind of moderated what the market would bear from our own human nature, and we took human nature out of the calculation, and so it helped to push rents higher. Is that collusion? I don't think so. Did it result in more aggressive rent setting? It absolutely did. Okay. So then we had concessions that happened here. This was the path that we were on right before COVID. COVID flattened out. Then post-COVID, we had huge absorption numbers. And as soon as vacancies went down really quickly, everybody raised their rents to the point where we had one trailing 12-month period where rents were up 20% year over year. The next quarter, it was 15% year over year. The next quarter, it was 10% year over year. And then the next quarter, it was 5% year over year.
So your algorithmic blue and green lines broke apart there. What happened?
Well, this is where vacancy got so big.
That the humans started calling the other humans and being like, I don't understand. I don't want to pay that much for rent.
Well, that people started freaking out and going, we have to lower our rents because we overbuilt the market. And now we, as a 1970s product, are competing with a brand new 2020s high rise that's playing in our dollar range. And so now we're having to offer concessions to keep our people, because what really has happened since this point, you can see that we overshot it. That was an overcorrection. Now here's where we were headed. Now we're below that. So we've had a market correction now the other direction. Gross rents are below it and net rents are way below, significantly below it. And the good news, this is good news for my industry, by the way, that what you're seeing right now, this looks like bad news. It's actually the only good news we've had in a few years, which is that net rents are up 1.5% quarter over quarter. I think we hit the bottom of the real estate cycle. The fourth quarter of 2025, the first quarter of 2026 was flat. And now the second quarter of 2026, we're actually seeing gross rents went up, net rents went up quarter over quarter for the first time. Annual growth is still negative, right? And that's what this next slide shows is, oh, well, hold on. First, I'm going to say, because I forgot I did this. I saw this last night. So according to the Denver Post, Metro Denver home prices continue to hold at mid-2022 levels. Okay, so rents went way up and single family home prices are the same as they were from 4 years ago. So that should reduce the gap between rent and own, right? That should reduce that gap. Nope, because our rents are now the same place they were 4 to 5 years ago. This is just zoomed into the last 5 years.
That looks like the correction maybe is behind us.
That's the good news that the people in my industry are going to be actually happy to see, because all we've seen is this for the last 2 to 3 years. So, but it's going to take a while for that annual rent growth to clear to positive. You know,
Year.
each quarter,
Yeah.
right? Each quarter of rent growth does not a full year of rent growth make. So we need to see that rents today are higher than they were a year ago. And that's when people are like, oh, I'm actually making money again. Like it's starting to come back. All right, so effective rent growth. Again, you can see here, COVID, rent growth went negative. We were offering concessions. And then this is the overcorrection in the market where we went to 20% and it fell down. But what you'll see now is that for 9 quarters in a row, we've had negative annual rent growth.
Which is deeper than the prior recession.
Yeah, this is the deepest it's been since we've been doing our surveys for 22 years now. I'm sure the 80s looked this bad. The 80s were terrible, right? The 80s it was a very bad time for Denver. But since then, we've not seen anything like this. So the good news is that this actually stopped bottoming out and it started to turn upward. So that's the good news. Colorado Springs had 13 quarters of negative rent growth because they overbuilt their market a full year before we did. And so they're a little bit further along in their recovery. And they actually saw positive annual rent growth for the first time this quarter. So moving on, effective rents by year of construction. Again, everything is what you would expect. Newer units are more expensive, older units are more affordable, right? Well, what has happened is you can see that these 90s and 2000s kind of have always run together because it's basically the same construction type. 80s and 70s are different construction types, usually 8-foot ceilings versus 9-foot ceilings, and especially 70s product and older, like true garden level, right? And so less expensive, what we would call naturally affordable. But what has happened is this top-down pressure of high vacancy and high concessions has put huge pressure on those lower, older vintage properties. Like I said, the 70s vintage has the highest vacancy right now, by far. And so they've had to lower their rents even further. But what you'll see here is that the 2020s, 2010s, 2000s, and 1990s, they've all compressed. it doesn't matter what vintage of apartment you live in, it's basically the same price. And what does that do? Well, that means if I live in a 90s product and I can move into a brand new 2020s product that's totally tricked out with all the most awesome new amenities, and I can live in an elevator building with a concierge and, in downtown, if people want to live downtown, which I personally would, people are flocking to those because those are, if you look where that orange line is popping out, it is cheaper to live in a new 2020s deal than it is in a 2010s or a 1990s deal. And it's barely more expensive to live in a 2020s deal than it is a 2000s deal.
But all things are not equal. Right? In that 70s or 80s product is likely bigger than the new, right? So it depends on, are you sensitive to price? Are you sensitive to location? Are you sensitive to
Square footage.
I'd rather have more square footage to live in.
It depends on who you are, and I think especially younger people
Yeah.
are okay with smaller units. And right now, this is not just on studios and 1-bedrooms. You can get 12 weeks free on a 2-bedroom unit, right? So and as these units get cheaper, then the people in the 80s and 70s product move up to 90s and 2000s or even 2020s product at this point. Because the difference in rent isn't that big. If you zoom in on this, there's only $115 per month difference between these 4 vintages.
What happens in the 1950s and 60s buildings? Do we scrape them? And is it really better to actually make them go away from the market?
It depends on where they are. It depends on how they've been maintained over time. There are 40s and 50s product that are beautiful, that have been well maintained, well renovated, that are killing it. And I would buy one of those in a heartbeat today, as long as it had historically been well maintained. If it's not well maintained, it's at the end of its useful life and it needs to go.
Right, if you own the whole building, you can make that decision, right? You scrape it, build a brand new building, get higher rents all over.
You can, but how much do you think it costs to build an apartment unit, just a single unit per unit, when you're building with the efficiencies of building, the average size is 233 units. That's the average size of new apartment communities, because you get efficiencies in operation and you get efficiencies in construction at basically above 200. And if you go above 300, then you start worrying about cannibalizing your own demand. Because then you're starting, at 400 units a year, you have to refill 200 units a year at a 50% turnover rate. And that's 16 units a month as opposed to 8 units a month. And that's the kind of lease-up velocity that you get in lease-up when you're offering a concession to get those units full.
Yeah.
So there's a
What's the per door?
there's a
number
too
though?
big, but depends on the type of property you're building. But if you're building a standard walk-up, not garden level, because we don't do that anymore, but a 3-story walk-up that doesn't require an elevator, that's going to run you between $320 and $350 a door to build.
Right.
For a mid-rise, 4 stories to 7 stories, that's going to run you $375 a door. And for a high-rise, that's going to run you $500 plus a door. Average rents by county, again, just remember that these are all averages and that Douglas County is a lot more expensive than Adams County. Average rents in each county stack up differently, and they stack up the way you would expect. Boulder would probably be the top dog on this chart, but we combine that with Broomfield because the apartment association has always had those together. Well, because Broomfield didn't used to be its own municipality.
That's right.
And their survey is older than Broomfield as a county. And so rather than updating that and taking the two separate, we took their survey over in 2021 from a DU professor who was retiring. And they just wanted us to continue to do Boulder Broomfield. But what you will see is that, Arapahoe and Adams are by far the lowest. Denver and Jeffco generally float just above average. And then Boulder and Douglas County are a lot more expensive.
The Boulder one, does that include Longmont?
It includes all of Boulder County. So it includes Longmont, Erie, Superior, Louisville, Lafayette, all of it. It's not just Boulder proper. If it was Boulder proper, it'd be even higher. New construction, let's talk about this. So building permits, what's happened historically, when you see the blue lines popping up, that means we're pulling more multifamily permits than single family. When you see the, it hide behind the kind of the beige, that means you're pulling more single family permits. Right now, for the last several years, we've basically been pulling significantly more multifamily permits, except for a couple of months here in the 2024 period. Again, historically, this yellow line is apartments. That used to be about 25% of the market. 2009, 2010 hit, we stopped building condos. We filled all those permits with apartments. We didn't just stop building them. We just, instead of selling them, we rented them. So from that point forward, the long-term average is about 50% of the market is multifamily permits. Right now in 2025, we pulled 60% multifamily permits. So it was a 60-40 compared to, 30% detached, 10% attached. And what you will see here is that exact story. We used to build condos. We stopped building condos, and we no longer really build very many condos moving forward. Now, I know you guys don't want to sell condos right now. So saying we should build more condos is probably anathema to how you feel, but that's really what would help with the affordability crisis in the market right now. So this is the permit story we talked about. You'll see that we were pulling about 10,000 permits, just, 14,000, 50,000 permits, and we were building about that many number of units. Well, in 2021, we pulled 21,400 units. So that was a harbinger that in 2024, we were going to deliver a lot of units. And I kept raising my hand and raising the red flag, and the development community said, we don't have the labor, don't worry about it. It's going to be fine. Well, it wasn't fine. And now I lovingly say that a developer will ride the wave until it crashes. They don't know how to get off, let alone win. They don't know how it has to crash. And so they pulled 21,000, then they pulled 19,000 the next year. So you're expecting in 24 and 25 to have outsized deliveries. Well, instead of 21,000, we delivered 23 and 24. And instead of 19,000, we delivered 14,000. And that's partially because we did a few of them faster than the average. Well, and because that average is really 30 months, not 36 months, some of those fell into the 2024 period, even though they were permitted at the beginning of 2022. But moving forward, we're pulling much more normal levels of permits, and those permits are going to continue to shrink. So starts versus permits. Here we were starting more units than we were completing. Starts versus completions. If you start more units than you complete, your pipeline, your under construction and proposed, your under construction pipeline grows. Well, it grew until we started a whole bunch more units. In 2024, we completed a whole bunch more units than we started. So that's when the pipeline started to shrink. And because of things like the inclusionary housing ordinance, which is disincentivizing new development, we have a future pipeline that is slowly dwindling away. And you can see that that's falling down. And according to what we're modeling, we think that we're going to continue to complete more units than we start for the next few years. And as that happens, the pipeline is going to continue to shrink. Under construction, right now we have about 24,000 units under construction. We were as high as 45,000 units a couple quarters ago, and by a couple years ago, really, at this point. But that's down 48% from the peak. And that was not a healthy peak. That was too much. But we're going to continue to see this falling down and falling down and falling down. Under proposed units, here we go. We hit up to 77,000 of proposed units was our high water mark. We're down to 30,000 units. But there's a caveat with the 30,000 units that are in this proposed pipeline. And that is that about 20,000 units have been locked up in the city and county of Denver for 4+ years now. There are basically what happened is June 30th, 2022 was this magic date. You had to have your site development plan in. You had to have your application into the city and county of Denver by that date to be grandfathered in and not have to live up to the inclusionary housing ordinance requirements. So when that happened, we had a huge run-up of applications because nobody wanted to live up to the inclusionary housing ordinance. And then from that point forward, we've limped along with very few applications. And the real numbers of applications have been affordable, like tax credit housing, not conventional market rate housing in the city and county of Denver. So there are 20,000 units that have been proposed for 4 years that are still in the proposed pipeline that have not broken through to the under construction pipeline because they are not economically feasible. And they're not economically feasible without the subsidies. So then if you add the subsidies onto it, you're definitely not economically feasible if you lose your grandfather status. So all this to say, historically, you had 18 months once you got a site development plan approval to break ground. If you didn't, you lost your SDP approval. If you lost your SDP approval, you lost your grandfather status. Well, City and County of Denver realized that our pipeline is falling off a cliff and that if we don't deliver units, we're going to have vacancy go way down and rents are going to spike back up. And the whole point of this inclusionary housing ordinance program was to create affordable housing for people. And instead, what it did was it created a whole bunch of conventional development to not have to do it. And then when the actual program takes effect, there's going to be no affordable housing. And so we created affordable housing by overbuilding the market, supply and demand, right? Economics 101. We're oversupplied, rents go down, it's more affordable for everybody. We disincentivize development, we stop building. Now we're undersupplied. Demand exceeds supply, rents go right back up, and we don't provide any affordable housing. To your question about rent control, that's a form of rent control. Didn't work. Another form of rent control is basically just capping your annual, you can't make more than a 3% increase on your rents per year, or a 5% or a 10% or whatever it is. And usually they start incrementally. They'll be like, oh, it can't be more than 10, and then it can't be more than 8, then it can't be more than 5, as people get used to it, and then it can't be more than 3. But what happens is that disincentivizes people who own those buildings to maintain them appropriately. And so you start creating basically slumlords because they aren't making enough money to reinvest in their properties to fix the deferred maintenance. That, or what they do is they say, I'm not going to make enough money because equity seeks a return. And so they pull those units and they do convert them to condos. And they pull them out of the rental inventory. And the rental inventory, and this is what happened in San Francisco and in New York and Manhattan, is people were like, never mind, I'm not going to rent these anymore. I'm going to sell them off, or we're going to co-op them. And then you start seeing your total number of units that are available to rent going down. And again, supply coming down, demand staying high, you create the opposite effect. You're not creating affordable housing. What rent control does is it creates a small number of winners, whoever won that lottery, and then it makes everybody else losers.